All right, so welcome on behalf of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My name is Karine Mogg. I am the director here of the Meter Center, and it is our great joy to welcome you to this session. This is one of our series of Reformation conversations featuring authors of recent or forthcoming works in Reformation studies. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Matthew Barrett. Matthew is professor of Christian theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he has several publications already to his credit, such as Simply Trinity, the Unmanipulated Father, Son, and Spirit, published by Baker, and another book called None Greater, The Undomesticated Attributes of God, also published by Baker, God's Word Alone, the Authority of Scripture, published by Zondervan, and Canon, Covenant, and Christology, Rethinking Jesus and the Scriptures of Israel, published by IVP. Today, he's going to be talking to us about his most recent book, which is called The Reformation as Renewal, Retrieving the One Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, to be published by Zondervan and due out, I believe, in early June. Am I right? Is that correct, Matthew? Yep.
That's right.
So I'm going to hand it over to Matthew. So Matthew's going to talk to us about the themes of his book and the ideas that he is working through in this work. Then I'll get a chance to start us off with some questions, and then anyone else part of the discussion will be welcome to ask your questions. You can either unmute and ask your question at that time or put something in the chat, whatever is most comfortable for you. So Matthew, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I won't take up too much time. I love and enjoy answering questions that you may have, and so I do want to leave a good amount of time for that. As Karen mentioned, this is a book that's about to release. I've even seen it in the hands of some already. It's a large book. It's bigger than I anticipated, and that may be a good segue into the topic itself. There are many outstanding books on the Reformation. Karen, even what you are doing there, you are well aware of just the flood of books that come in year by year on the Reformation. And so I was aware in my own mind, why am I writing another book on the Reformation when so much good scholarship has been done? The reason I did so, well, in one sense, it is contextual. I noticed even in my own educational training, as well as I've been teaching now for 10 years, and I've noticed this even in the way that students are presented with the Reformation. There can be an interpretive trajectory from the very start that if it is the wrong trajectory, it will lead, say, the student of the Reformation down the wrong path. And by consequence, even though it could be well-meaning, they may misinterpret the Reformation and sometimes in serious ways. Now, let me just give a couple of examples of this, and some of our viewers may be familiar with these. First of all, you have some pockets of historians or theologians who will lament the Reformation, usually for one or two reasons, sometimes both combined, usually because it caused schism, or more recently, another line is that the Reformation is to blame for secularism today, really with the rise of the Enlightenment and modernism. Now, the advocates of this type of reading of the Reformation are many, and sometimes very diverse. I don't want to paint them as if they're all the same. Sometimes they have very different perspectives or even agendas. It can be as wide as, say, the group known as Radical Orthodoxy to, it'll show up as well in well-known historians like Brad Gregory and many others. Now, it's a long, complicated interpretation, but essentially it looks at the Reformation and says, well, the Reformers were the carriers of that voluntarist, nominalist virus that eventually plagues and explains to some degree modernism itself. And what they mean by this is that with voluntarism and nominalism, so here they look to say everyone from like late medievals like Duns Scotus to William of Ockham to Gabriel Biel, and they say here is a severing of participation in the likeness of God, a movement towards that which is external, and a severing of God's presence, God's real presence, the internal, as they would call it. And with the Reformation comes this perpetuation of this shift in emphasis. And they would say, well, you see it especially with the Reformation's emphasis on, say, an external or alien righteousness, say, in justification, with something like the imputation of Christ's righteousness, or even with their understanding of the sacraments, etc. And from there, again, I'm painting with a very broad brush. From there, they might argue that this then is a trajectory that puts us on a trajectory towards what we will see eventually in later centuries with the rise of modernism and the way that it more radically severs that participation link. So this has been a very popular interpretation of the Reformation. Now, to just swing the pendulum to the other side, sometimes in evangelical circles, another popular interpretation of the Reformation is not to lament the Reformation, but to actually celebrate the Reformation because it's a break with the Catholicity that's come before it. Now, this might surprise some people because you might think, well, goodness, hasn't there been quite a bit of literature by Obermann and Richard Muller and David Steinmetz? And you'd be right, there has. And yet this type of, I call it in my book, the oppositional narrative, because it views the Reformation as fundamentally an opposition to that which came before. I point this out as well. There's a bit of irony attached to this type of narrative, because in the 19th and 20th centuries, though it's not the exact same line, Protestant liberalism also celebrated the Reformation, but they celebrated the Reformation because they saw this as, yes, also a break with the past, and therefore the ultimate moment, the turning point by which, I think of Luther in this case, Luther is this Enlightenment man before there is even an Enlightenment yet. He's on the verge of a new turn in history towards the elevation of the individual and autonomous reason, etc. So again, different outcome, but also a similar line. Now, what I try to do is move past some of these narratives, which I think are mistaken. It's not that there's not any truth at all. So take, for example, the narrative that's laments the Reformation for secularism. Okay, I actually think it makes a very astute point, say Radical Orthodoxy, when they argue that a Scotus or an Occam or a Biel, well, they are drastically and sometimes quite aggressively, think of Occam, for example, severing that participation link that was just assumed for centuries before, given the philosophy and theology from Augustine to Aquinas. And so
hey, Matthew's on mute. Okay.
There we go. Can you hear me okay? Okay. My book, its main attention is not to address some of these narratives. But in light of these narratives, I try to move past them by showing that there's a better way. And I do that I try to do it organically by giving a history of the Reformation afresh, but one that is paying attention to the Reformers' own voices, demonstrating through each pocket of the Reformation that actually things were more complex than any one of these narratives lets on. And to show that, I'm certainly not the first to point this out. Just to give you an example here, the historian Pelikan, he has a great way of putting this when he says there is a Catholic substance, by which he means there's a body of tradition, liturgy, dogma, and churchmanship that developed chiefly by the ancient church and embodied but not exhausted for someone like Luther in the Roman Catholic Church of his day. And then at the same time, there was what he calls a Protestant principle, a summary term for the criticism and reconstruction of this Catholic substance, which, say, Luther and his Reformation carried out in the name of the Christian gospel and with the authority of the Bible. But in light of these recent narratives, I'm picking up on this Catholic substance and Protestant principle, this point, to show if we listen to the Reformers' own voices, what we discover is exactly that. And so I work my way from, what you would expect for a history of the Reformation. But the first 350 pages of the book are devoted to, even though it's not by any means meant to be an exhaustive survey, they are devoted to showing the medieval context. For example, I think one of the reasons some of these narratives have been perpetuated is because we don't pay attention to what the fullness of what's happening, say, in a year like 1517. We love, our eyes go to, Luther's 95 Theses, but we forget that just before that, Luther is also writing theses for his disputation against scholastic theology. And when we look at these theses, what do we discover? Well, it's actually not a response to just the whole swath of scholastic thought. Luther has someone very specific in mind, and sure enough, it is that via moderna of an Occam or a Beale. In fact, he'll even mention Duns Scotus as well. So these are telling moments that sometimes get missed in retellings of the Reformation. And it sheds new light, I think, on what the Reformers are reacting to and what they are not reacting to. Just to give some other examples of this type of work in the sources themselves, take what might be maybe the more radical developments when you consider different pockets of the Reformation, and that would be in Zurich. Of course, our eyes are naturally drawn to someone like Zwingli, but when we look also at the way that the Reformation develops in Zurich with Bullinger, or Bullinger, depending on how you want to pronounce it, we see a very emphatic and intentional emphasis by this reformer on the Catholicity of his own Reformation, his own Swiss Reformation. And we see this specifically with his book Of the Holy Catholic Church. This happens again and again and again. You'll see it in England with John Jewell or Fox in his Book of Martyrs. You see it with Calvin, for example, in his response to Cardinal Sadoleto, or his reforming measures, whether it be his catechism or his company of pastors. You see it with, to take just another, maybe an outlier, you see it with someone like Peter Martyr Vermigli, the way that he is developing his own theology in conversation with the church fathers, and even that strand of Thomism that he thinks is philosophically viable to advance the Reformation. The point I'm trying to make is this: the Reformers, what is motivating them? Why would they write such works, and why would they be so emphatic with such an emphasis on their own Catholicity? Well, we have to remember in context, the reformers were being accused of novelty, as if, and potentially even heresy. We have to remember in the 16th century, those two things often went together. To be original or to be novel was a very dangerous thing. And sometimes they were even confused with, which this frustrated the reformers to no end, but sometimes they were even confused with those whom the reformers considered the true radicals, who broke off from the Reformation. What Obermann calls tradition zero, as opposed to tradition one. So in response to this confusion and these accusations, the reformers were quite adamant. No, we haven't departed from the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, but we have every right to it. In fact, and this often enraged Rome, but they went so far at times to say, we actually think we are more faithful to the Catholicity that we embody than you may be. This was a critical claim, because anything less than this would have then substantiated Rome's charges that, no, you are novel and the doctrines you are teaching are quite innovative. So this propelled the reformers and to defend their Catholicity against these charges. And what I found so remarkable was, this book I've written is about 900 pages. And the reason it's so long is because each corner of the Reformation, for all their differences over, say, the Lord's Supper, for example, each corner of the Reformation has a remarkable consensus on this issue. In other words, they have their own style and they do it in their own way and in their own context. But whether you are looking at Luther and Melanchthon at Augsburg, or whether you are looking at Calvin in Geneva, or whether you're looking at Zwingli and Bullinger in their Swiss territories, whatever corner of or England, right, with Cranmer and Jewell, what's so remarkable is that this issue comes right back to the center of their response, so that they see themselves in line with the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And they have some remarkable statements. I can't help but quote Bruce Gordon at this point, who says, if Calvin would have been told that Rome was Catholic, Calvin would have been just mortified by that statement, because he considered himself truly Catholic. So it's these moments that are quite telling, but have sometimes been missed in our retellings of the Reformation. I'll make one more point, because I did mention some of those narratives about the Reformation that I think sometimes lead us astray. And the point is this: when we look at the theology of the Reformers, we could even go further to say they not only make this claim to Catholicity, but as they make the claim, they seem to be developing and are more and more aware of what they are countering. In other words, take Calvin, for example. Isn't it interesting that despite the claims that the Reformation is responsible for secularism because it supposedly abandons this idea of participation, isn't it interesting that whether Calvin is talking about divine providence, union with Christ, or the Lord's Supper, he is retrieving this concept of participation to do so. This has come to light recently with Todd Billings' fantastic work on Calvin, gift, and participation. Julie Canlis has done something similar in her own way, and others. And so what we're seeing in Reformation studies, I think, in the 21st century is a bit of a resurgence, maybe a quiet one, but a bit of a resurgence to dive back into the sources, to listen to the reformers and their own voices, and to recognize that actually with something like participation, they do have a doctrine of participation. And though it may be different from some of those late medievals, actually they, in their own minds, they think it's bringing the Augustinian or the Thomistic understand participation to fulfillment in a more Protestant way. All this to say, when you look at someone like Calvin, I think it's maybe appropriate to end with Calvin, since this is, after all, the Meter Center and Calvin College. I don't think it's accidental that someone like Calvin could then say, in response to Rome, this is a great statement, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he could say, when we put everything on the scales, there is no doubt that the patristic weight falls in our favor. And that was a claim that was bold, but Calvin was convinced that the Reformation's theology from beginning to end would bear that out, and in the end would have the support of the Catholic Church, even if the Reformers were not Roman. Well, I'll stop there. There's so much more I could say, but I'd love to entertain any questions or comments.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Matthew. I think that's given us a lot to start out with. I'd like to start, if I could. Were the Reformers' claims to Catholicity, in fact, deliberately engaged when they were conversing with Roman Catholics? In other words, was their ground of their claim, did that change depending on who they were in conversation with? In other words, if two different Reformation groups are in conversation with each other, does the ground of the claim change to become then faithfulness to Scripture, for instance? Who's more faithful to Scripture, not who's more in the Catholic tradition? In other words, how much is this shaped by the interlocutor that each group is talking to when you try and say, okay, who's claiming the tradition of Catholicism?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. Let me see if I can give an example of this. So let's take the Lord's Supper. When Luther is turned, he's postured towards Rome and transubstantiation. And we see this even early on, 1520s. What's so fascinating is Luther, and this is a common misconception of Luther. We think, oh, Luther is against transubstantiation. And in our minds, we think, oh, that means that he's against the presence of Christ. Luther would have been so disturbed by that. Luther is so upset about transubstantiation because he does not think it captures the presence, the real presence enough, which is so counterintuitive to the way that sometimes we describe these debates today. In other words, for Luther, just to try to sum him up, he thinks, well, if the elements are just transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ, Luther feels like that's not really a union that has occurred as much as it is a transubstantiation. And so Luther then begins this journey, which, it's developing as he goes from the 1520s forward. Well, then what is occurring? And here Luther is more and more understanding there has to be a sacramental union that actually occurs to in his mind, grasp onto what he thinks is a truly real presence. Now, whether we agree or disagree, with where Luther ends up and how he explains his theory of Christ's presence is neither here nor there. The point is, here you see Luther making this move because he doesn't think that Rome has actually preserved the truly Catholic understanding of the real presence that Luther sees from past centuries. Now, to answer your question though, when Luther then turns, right, this is the part where we become really uncomfortable because it's all that division that we see in the 16th century. When he turns then to someone like Zwingli, isn't it interesting that it's not as if, and they're having all kinds of exegetical arguments over John 6, for example. Isn't it interesting that the subject of Catholicity doesn't disappear? It continues, but now it's almost changed gears, if I could use that metaphor, because now Zwingli is saying, no, I'm more Catholic, because my reading of scripture is figurative, as it should be. Why would we read Christ is the door or Christ is the shepherd and then go to this verse on the supper where it says, this is my body? Why would we make that change? And so Zwingli thinks, and then Zwingli goes to the creed to say, it says that Christ ascended into heaven, so I must be the more Catholic one, Luther. And as we know, Luther is well, this really ticks him off, because Luther says, no, you cannot be more Catholic, because my reading of Scripture, my hermeneutic, actually preserves the grace of the gospel itself. Because if there's not a real presence, then how do we have access to Christ and all the benefits of Christ and our union with him? And so Luther, so the point is, again, and we could go on and talk about Calvin, but the point is here, this is a fascinating test case, because whether they're pointed polemically outward towards Rome or having this inward debate with one another, Catholicity doesn't disappear, but there is a change of gear, because they are in this constant mode of trying to discern, okay, as we read the scriptures, what is the foundation on which our Catholic faith rests?
Absolutely.
Of course, they don't agree in the end, but
they're having essentially competing authority claims. I mean, this is what lays at the heart of it. What is authoritative, and how do we articulate that authority? The other question I had for you is to do with how this project might serve, so how your book might serve the church today. In other words, should we read this as, and I haven't obviously read it because we don't have the print copy yet, but I will. Should we read this project as an attempt to talk primarily to other Protestants, or to talk to a wider audience? Does it have an ecumenical focus? Like, talk a little more about that.
Yeah. It's really fascinating when you look at Pelikan. I quoted him earlier. The second half of that book that he writes, he really does have an ecumenical focus. Now, my book is more historically focused, and so I don't really tread into those waters. But the question is not irrelevant, because when you read the book, it's clear from the very beginning that yes, I do think there are some significant implications for the Protestant church today. Let me just name two of them. One of them is, I think as Protestants, so here I'm just going to speak to Protestants for a minute. I think as Protestants, we've heard this narrative that has been both at a popular level and at an academic level. We've heard this narrative thrive that, well, maybe we are to blame for the secularism that came after the Reformation. And my word is simply to say, when you look at the historical evidence, I don't think that claim stands. And so to Protestants, don't feel that enormous guilt that, oh goodness, we don't have a doctrine of participation. And yeah, our emphasis was only external. So how have we gone this voluntarist nominalist route? Maybe we have. And I think that it's probably time for Protestants to maybe stand up a little bit and say, both on the basis of history and theology, actually the evidence seems to say otherwise. And so if we are going to put the blame, it needs to be elsewhere. The second thing I would say, and this is more, so that's a little bit more outward focused, but more inward focused, I would say, I think our pedagogy needs to change. From one teacher to maybe other teachers who are listening. If you just jump right into the Reformation, or let me put it this way, if you jump right into the 16th century, we risk a lot, right? Let me just give you an example. You'll hear narratives out there that say, well, to be Protestant, or in the 16th century, to be reformational meant that the reformers were antithetical to, say, Thomas Aquinas. Well, that can preach. But again, and you can imagine even the evangelical agenda that could really preach that, right? To say, yeah, we're Protestant after all. And the problem is, when you go back to the 16th century, and not just the 16th century, but the 17th century, the historical evidence shows otherwise. Did Protestants have major disagreements with Thomas Aquinas? Of course, absolutely. But where were those disagreements? Oftentimes they were on, say, well, is the righteousness of Christ, is this infused or imputed? What do we think about the authority of the papacy? So of course, these are natural disagreements. At the same time, though, why is it that we have this whole category called Protestant scholasticism? Or more specifically, Reformed scholasticism rise up when suddenly there are new threats to the doctrine of God, and they are dependent and relying both philosophically and theologically on the insights of Thomas Aquinas, on, say, the Trinity or the attributes of God or Christology. Well, in light of codifying their faith, they have to move beyond just soteriology and ecclesiology to expand their horizons to the whole of the Christian faith, which includes those doctrines. And in light of polemical pressures like Socinianism, it becomes all the more expedient that they demonstrate, no, we actually have a philosophical and theological tie to this Augustinian and Thomistic strand, whereas you don't. So we're not the true heretics, the Socinians are. So there's a bit of a polemical pressure there as well. So those are just some examples, but as you can see, I think today, to really bring this home, I would say today there is a strong tendency, maybe among those who are just excited and coming into the Protestant faith and are young, to think, well, to be Protestant then means I sever my Protestantism from Christianity, or the Church Catholic, the Church Universal. And I think that would have been appalling to the reformers and their immediate heirs. And I think by consequence, worst case scenario, we're not actually Protestant in the end, we're more radical, which the reformers would have recognized in their century. I think we need to recognize that in our century today.
Thank you. That's so helpful. So what I'd like to do now is offer others the chance to contribute by either asking questions, sharing insights. If you prefer to type, you can just go ahead and type in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question just orally, you can go ahead and unmute, and I will recognize you, and you can go right ahead.
I got one.
Go ahead. Yes.
Matt, I'm excited to read your book. I'm a pastor in Utah, and I'm trying to actually do that. It's interesting. There's no sense of church history in our Baptist out here. So I'm going to be teaching on the Nicene Creed in the fall.
Oh, good.
And one of the things I noticed, and I can't find an answer to it, is why does it seem like the reformers seem to prefer the Apostles' Creed and using that as like a teaching structure over the Nicene Creed? Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, Dustin, I think it is well done taking the Nicene Creed into the pews. I'm so encouraged to hear that. I think that needs to be done more and more. Just giving your people a grammar for orthodoxy is so important. So thank you. Super helpful, because we live in a town that's 95% Mormon. Yeah. And there's this tendency within our church to want to compromise and say, well, Christians. So that's the Nicene Creed as well. This clearly is like, states against more theology. Yeah. All the more reason, right? All the more reason to ground your people in Christian orthodoxy so that they don't make that move.
But to your question about the Reformation, I think there can be different reasons. It depends on who you're referring to. Sometimes the reasons are purely practical. And you could imagine this type of scenario with someone who is young in the faith, taking them to a very short, concise Apostles' Creed is a very easy move, and one that is a great first step. And so naturally, I mean, you think, for example, of Luther, when Luther has this devastating moment, you know, he's high on the fumes of the Reformation, and then he says, well, let's go check on the churches and see how they're doing. And then he comes back and he's devastated, right? Because he realizes, oh, what's happening? I've been laboring so hard and they don't even know the Lord's Prayer. And here sometimes he's not just talking about churchgoers, but even sometimes pastors. And so this is a great moment, because here you might think, well, Luther, here Luther is, sola scriptura. So, but actually sola scriptura for Luther meant to interpret scripture as our highest authority, and to do so in the right way meant that we need to stand on the shoulders of others to make sure that we're not misusing scripture for our own, imagination. And here's, I think, where Luther, in the midst of that devastation, is at his finest, because Luther says, okay, let's do a couple things. Number one, let's teach them the Lord's Prayer. Let's make sure they know the 10 Commandments. Let's bring in the Apostles' Creed. Let's just have them start there and memorize that. All that to say, I don't think it's the case that, they're choosing the Apostles' Creed and they really got problems with the Nicene Creed. That would be problematic just purely in terms of content, because obviously the Nicene Creed is echoing so much of what the Apostles' Creed says. I think rather what's happening is you see them in a moment of true pedagogy appealing to the Apostles' Creed as just a basic nutrient of the faith, so that they can build from there. And it's no surprise then that Luther goes on. In fact, later in it, he will write an entire treatise on how the Lutherans are confessional and they're creedal people. And here he mentions the Nicene Creed, and he says, yes, we absolutely affirm the Nicene Creed, and because we're Orthodox. And so it's not that they are embarrassed by it or disagree with it. In fact, they're quite adamant that the church needs to confess this creed, but for different reasons, depending on who they are contextually trying to treat, almost like a doctor and a patient. They may begin with the Apostles' Creed because in many ways it's an ideal point even for the liturgy of the church. There's other reasons as well, but that's one that comes to my mind.
What's the Luther resource that you just said where he talks about
where Luther writes about it? Yes,
yeah.
He has this little treatise. If you look at the American edition of Luther's works, I forget the volume number. If you contact me, I can send it to you. And he writes a little treatise on the creeds, and it's short, but it reveals that Luther is quite mindful of situating the Lutheran Church within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. So let's see, other questions or comments. So you can unmute if you like, or type something. Here we've got someone who's typed. Let's see. Jeff Mindler, could you speak to the Reformers' reception of the eternal generation of the Son, and specifically Calvin's articulation of the Son as autotheos?
Karen, we will need a couple hours.
This is Jeff's question, not mine.
Oh boy. Oh, well, it pains me to say this, but I had to remove about 100 pages in my book. And anyone who's an author knows how painful this is. The book was already long enough. I had to remove about 100 pages on Calvin, and a good chunk of them dealt with Calvin and the Trinity. I'm hoping that will, that material will make, see the light of day in another book. But I wrestled with this issue to no end. Let me just say this at the beginning. Brandon Ellis has a very helpful book on this very subject. And so if you just look up his book on Calvin and autotheos and the Son, he gives you a very detailed, even chronological tour through this entire controversy. So there's no way I could treat it all here, but let me just say this. And, this is controversial. You'll have Reformed people today, some trying to defend Calvin, some saying Calvin maybe goes off here. So you'll see Reformed people on each side of this issue. But historically, let me just make this point. I think it has been shown historically that Calvin is more in the minority report on this issue in comparison to what others have called the majority report when you look at other Reformed theologians, both in the 16th century, but also the 17th century as well. I think that's a helpful observation to make, because sometimes, maybe given the mountain of literature and publications like Calvin, we can tend to think Calvin was the only Reformed thinker. He was one among others. Granted, Calvin was an outstanding one, but he was one among others. I mean, some in his day, like Bullinger, debatably were even more popular than Calvin. So that's important to keep in mind, because I know sometimes people can get uneasy at this point. Oh no, what are we saying about Calvin? But historically, I think that's true enough. As much as I wrestled with the sources historically, I think Calvin is in the minority report. Now, Carl Trueman makes a great point when he says that we have to remember that the Reformers are often developing as they go. And so one decade you may see one thing, another decade you may say another thing. Calvin affirms eternal generation. Let me just make sure that's clear. However, given the way he's trying to defend the deity of Christ, he's drawn towards autotheos, or what we might call the aseity of the Son, in a way that pushes back against a definition of eternal generation that would say the Father is communicating the divine essence in all its perfection to the Son. I think the majority report, and this goes back to even the days of Nicaea, actually does say, when you look at the church fathers, they are very adamant that the Son is begotten from the Father's essence. Or they'll use different, Athanasius will use this language to say the Son is the offspring of the Father's essence. So you have to wrestle with the fact that Calvin's way of articulating autotheos here, it could rub up against those church fathers who do want to say the Father communicates the divine essence to the Son in eternal generation itself. Now, there's been some other scholarship done that has argued that's given Calvin a more benefit of the doubt reading to say, could he be trying to have his cake and eat it too? So that, yes, he's arguing for the Son's aseity in terms of deity, but nonetheless, Calvin is still affirming that the person of the Son is begotten from the Father. And there's been some fascinating studies as to subsequent Reformed theologians like Turretin or others, and questions as to how much are they self-consciously aligning with Calvin, and how much are they self-consciously actually separating themselves from Calvin. I think there's still some work to be done there. But all that to say, I think, as much as I've wrestled with this, I do think that Calvin is in the minority report. I don't think that makes him necessarily against, say, Nicene Trinitarianism, However, I do think the way he is articulating eternal generation may be moved and motivated by certain polemical debates he's having to defend the deity of Christ. I think there is a motivation there. There's so much more I could say. I'll leave it at that and let you, read Brandon Ellis's book. I wrote a small journal article on this in the Midwestern Journal. And like I said, I hope to write a little bit more on this with a future publication.
Thank you for that very thorough answer, even in a short space of time. Lyle Bierma has a question. Lyle, go ahead.
Thank you. Matthew, I was wondering whether you have a chapter on the Anabaptists or the Radical Reformation in your book. And even if you don't, would you say they saw themselves as small c Catholics also?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lyle. I really appreciate your question and how much you've thought over the 16th century yourself. I think you'll be pleased to find out I do have an entire chapter on what has been called the Radical Reformation, or the Radicals. My aim in that chapter is not so much to give an exhaustive history or survey of the radicals. There's been many fine studies, and there's no way I could do it in a chapter. But my focus is I do focus to show that I think, though there are degrees, I think that there is this vocal, intentional representation of their own position, that in which they say, we are returning to what they call primitive Christianity. Now, this is where it's complicated because, as you know so well, depending on what strand of the radical camp you are referring to, some push this further than others. So for example, some will go so far to say that we are returning to primitive Christianity, and the church has been lost since the apostles. I think you see this with Sebastian Franck, for example. He has that notorious sentence or statement where he says, Augustine and Ambrose and Gregory, not even one of them knew the Lord, and they were all apostles of Antichrist. So there you go. There's a very, when we say radical, there's the true meaning of that word. I think for someone like him, I don't know, in terms of the word itself, Catholicity, at least in terms of what the reformers meant by that, he was not in favor, because or at least if he was to use the language, what he meant by it was, I am only returning to primitive Christianity, which is the apostles themselves, because even as early as an Augustine or a Gregory, everything's been lost. The Antichrist has entered into our camp. Well, that's fairly radical, and that brings out an ecclesiology as well. Now, here's the thing, though, and maybe this is where you're going, I don't know. When you look at other radicals, they're not that extreme. Menno Simons. Menno is not that extreme. And in many ways, when you look at Menno's thoughts, he does align with the reformers on a range of issues. Some of them are theological, some are even political. Do you still see in Menno, though, that instinct? I think you still see it, and it comes out with his Christology. I think it comes out in painful ways with his Christology, because you start to wonder, Menno, if you would not have closed your eyes to, say, the definition of Chalcedon, you might have saved yourself from serious conflict over Christology with the reformers, in which Menno is revising the hypostatic union in serious ways. So I think the point well, let me put it this way. The point that I'm trying to make is, and to your question, do you still see a Catholicity? Perhaps, depending on who you're referring to. The problem, though, at least in the eyes of the magisterial reformers, the problem, though, is that it's always tainted or stained to one degree or another by the way that they view history. And so for that reason, they don't see themselves side by side with the radicals in terms of the correlation between scripture and tradition. And by consequence, then that has ecclesiastical and even political ramifications. I don't know if that gets at the heart of your question, but that's my attempt to answer it. Yeah.
All right. We have a web question as well from Inte Kim. He says, first of all, is there any historical evidence of those reformers trying to engage with Eastern Christians? In other words, Eastern Orthodox. Where does that fit in?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad that this was brought up. Because you would think, right? You would think, well, this could work against the reformers' cause. Ironically, it works. They think it works towards their cause. Mm-hmm. So, for example, take Calvin's famous debate with Cardinal Sadoleto. You may remember the context. Calvin has been exiled from Geneva. He's having the best time of his life, by the way. Peace, and he's getting to write, and he's being mentored by Martin Butzer and so on. And then suddenly Geneva comes back and says, we have been, Cardinal Sadoleto is trying to draw us back to Rome. You know, long story short here, Calvin decides he's going to write, and he's going to, and because keep in mind, Sadoleto is essentially saying to the Genevans, Calvin led you astray. Come back to Mother Church, come back, and you will no longer be outside the church. I mean, if you are in Geneva, that's a powerful claim, and especially on the heels of Calvin leaving, and maybe some of the animosity there, it's a tempting one. They might be tempted to say, okay. But Calvin writes a brilliant letter, in my opinion. He says many things that you would expect. He defends sola scriptura, he defends sola fide, and so on. But on the issue of Catholicity, it's very telling because Calvin says this, and here I'm just summing him up. He says, okay, Rome or Sadoleto, you're saying you are the Church Catholic, and I've led the Genevans astray outside the church. But I think your understanding of Catholicity is too narrow, which you can imagine upset Sadoleto, because he's saying, well, what do you mean? We are the church. You are the ones that are outside. We are the ones that are including. Calvin says, no, you're too narrow. If you think Catholicity begins and ends with Rome, what do we do with the Eastern Church? Are they lost? Are they not Catholic too? Are they unable to make claim to the creed and say, we too are part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? And this proves to be a powerful weapon in Calvin's hands, because think about what he's saying here. He's basically saying, and this is a bold thing to say, right? He's basically saying our Protestant retrieval, and by the way, that's the subtitle of my book, Retrieving the One Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The Protestant retrieval of Catholicity is a better renewal because it's a broader understanding of Catholicity than Rome is offering you. In other words, Calvin is saying, if you go back to Rome, your Catholicity is limited to Rome. But we understand Catholicity in a broader sense, even a more invisible sense, by means of where faith is found. And in that sense, we actually can answer that question that Sadoleto can't. And in other words, what he means is we actually can engage with the East. As much as Calvin has disagreements with the East, don't be mistaken about that. He certainly does. And some of them are very strong. But at the end of the day, he can point to Rome and say, you've defined the fence too narrow if Catholicity means it is only found in Rome. We, on the other hand, actually can have that broader conversation about the church in past centuries, because we think, and Calvin's an example of this, he will appeal to church fathers in the West, Augustine, for example, but he will also appeal to church fathers in the East because he thinks I'm actually in line with them on any number of crucial issues. And for Calvin, that every time he's quoting an Eastern Church father in his Institutes, the subtext is there, in which he doesn't have to say it, but he is embodying, as a reformer, he is not just, I think sometimes people think, oh, Calvin's just conversant. No, Calvin is actually appealing to them and retrieving them because he thinks he is bringing about a greater renewal of Catholicity, one that's not so narrow.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Other questions, other people who still have points they want to make, things they haven't had a chance to ask yet? Go ahead and unmute or type as you prefer. Make sure I haven't missed anybody. Anybody else still wanting to ask something? I've got another question in the meantime while people are thinking. So in about 2004, Scott Hendricks published a book called Recultivating the Vineyard. And his basic thesis is that, in fact, Catholics and Lutherans and Reformed folks and Anabaptists were all, in fact, offering competing visions of essentially re-Christianizing the broader population. In other words, that it's not that they're not necessarily always talking against each other, but they're offering different visions of what it means to be Christian in a genuine way. And I was wondering how his work intersects with yours.
I don't know that I interacted with that particular book, but I am familiar with his argument. And by the way, Hendricks comes up a number of times in my book because even if it's more through a historical lens, you think, for example, of his work on Luther, he is in some ways teasing that out as he is considering what Luther is saying. And so there's many points at which I've appealed to Scott Hendricks to say, in making my argument from Luther's sources, to say, hey, listen to how how Hendricks is interpreting Luther here, because he's trying to show you, and others have, David Yaiko, I think is his name, who's a Lutheran himself. He has made this argument with his article called Catholic Luther. Reminds me of Todd Billings' article Catholic Calvin. Again, this is a bit of a resurgence, but the point is, they're all making a similar argument that as you read the sources, you have to read them thoroughly to see that Luther's argument is for Catholicity. As bold as he is, Luther can be really bold. As bold as he is to make points that might seem to go against it. Now, to your question, Karen, it's an interesting argument that probably brings us beyond the Reformation into theological discussions today across denominations or even traditions. It depends. If what we mean is that some of the different traditions are saying similar things in different ways about, say, the core of orthodoxy, the core of Christian orthodoxy. So I'm not using orthodoxy in terms of Eastern Orthodoxy, but Nicene Trinitarian classical theism, orthodoxy, then yes. And I think that point is strategic, because just take the doctrine of the Trinity, for example. There's been some misunderstanding that's had to be corrected in recent decades, where some have said, well, the East didn't have any, understanding of divine simplicity, and that's a Western invention. They blame Augustine. Colin Gunton really promoted some of this, but historians like Lewis Ayres have come along and said, no, that's actually not. That's actually, when you look at the sources in these, they do, but they say it differently. It's sometimes in the midst of their exegesis or in their polemical treaties, and so sometimes it's more inferred, but it's there. So I think, that's just an example. But if that's what we mean, then I would say yes. There is a sense in which we have to pay attention to. Okay, there are differences in the way that we are articulating, or even in our rhetoric itself, or sometimes even in emphasis, but nonetheless, the core of what we're saying is all rooted in the same Christian orthodoxy. Now, that said, there's another sense in which I would say no, and it's this. If what we mean is, say, a doctrine like justification, I know that there have been sometimes very labor-intensive attempts to reconcile the differences. I am more pessimistic on. I would say it's not that there is no overlap, but I think at the end of the day, those differences that we first saw in the 16th century remain. And so, if what we mean is that, okay, on some of the Reformation debates over, say, like justification, it's not that there hasn't been any development. I don't want to deny that. But I think the core of those debates, or the core of those divides, the divide still remains to this day. And so that probably should inform then the type of ecumenism we are willing to engage in, and the type that we have to say, no, that's where I draw the line. Yeah,
I think that makes sense. I mean, I think Hendricks really was pointing towards common aims, such as commitments to education, commitments to pastoral care, commitments on a very practical level, that it makes sense to find the commonalities in aims, even though we've kind of built denominational hurdles between different groups, but that the overall mission in terms of church leaders looking at populations was actually very similar.
And to that point, towards the very end of my book, I do have a chapter on what we have sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. And I do defend the fact that it is a counter-Reformation. At the same time, though, I do pay attention and give credit to those who have said there is a Catholic renewal as well. So yes, it is a counter, but in the midst of the aftermath of everything, there is a very self-conscious awareness that on the pastoral level, as you're saying, there had to be reform. And as much as Trent certainly does divide the camps, there's no doubt about that. They are very clear about that. At the same time, though, if you look at the background of Trent, and I talk about this in the book, some of that background is galvanized by this deep concern that at the very least there needs to be clerical and pastoral reform in the churches, and you even see examples. I mean, this is interesting. Maybe there is a whole book on this, I don't know. You even see examples of certain Roman Catholics agreeing with the reformers to say, yes, we may disagree on justification, for example, or purgatory, or the Apocrypha, but we do agree that they are putting their finger on some abuses that we also will not stand for. And so I think that needs to be acknowledged. There's still, at the end of the day, a difference, right? I think certain Roman Catholic theologians of the 16th century will still say the reform is not so much theological as it is pastoral. Obviously, the reformers will disagree with that, to say, no, it needs to be both.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Thank you. Other questions or comments from anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to contribute yet? Up and down my list. Anybody else at this point?
Yeah, am I on?
Yes, John, you're on. Go ahead. John Tobler. Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you suppose are the next steps forward in terms of this reassessment? What are you encouraging students to take up in terms of study in this field? And to follow up with that, what are some existing contributions that you found to be really helpful along the way here, and maybe some not as helpful?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I appreciate the question because my book is large as it is. It could have been twice its size because each chapter is just a window, more or less inviting you into that pocket to say, okay, now let's go to England and see what's happening. Okay, now let's go let's go over to Geneva. And in that sense, it's brief. All that to say, I do think there's been some great steps taken. You think of names like Heike Obermann, Richard Muller, David Steinmetz, Pelikan, and others. There's been some great steps taken. And I think you had a strong push in this direction when you go back to, say, the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s. But now we're in the first quarter of the 21st century. And I think we're starting enough time has passed so that we can look back and say, okay, has it had its full effect or not? And in some ways, it's had a good effect. I don't know that it's had its full effect yet. And so I would say there's lots of great opportunities for other scholars to then jump into this conversation. Just to give, I mentioned earlier Todd Billings and his book on participation in Calvin and how important that book is. I think it's with either Oxford or Cambridge. How important that book is to correcting some of the caricatures. I think we probably need to see similar books written in other pockets of the 16th century. So, for example, it'd be fascinating to see something on Heinrich Bullinger on his work on the Catholic faith. Same thing with John Jewell. In other words, and some of these works haven't even been translated. We're still waiting on. So all that to say, I think there is a lot of room here historically, and then I haven't even talked about theologically. I think that you are starting to see some of these things translate into theological discussions. I think, for example, Michael Allen and Scott Swain and their fine book on Reformed Catholicity. In other words, they're saying, okay, we are Reformed, we're Presbyterian. What does this mean for us now? I think that same conversation needs to be had with Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and yes, believe it or not, Baptists, maybe especially Baptists, which I'm speaking to my own camp here. And so that's where I think there's just a huge lacuna just waiting. What does it mean to be Baptist and Catholic in the small c sense? I think that still needs to be done. So there's some helpful avenues there. In terms of what works have not been as helpful, that's an interesting question. Some of the works, and again, maybe this isn't so much intentional as it is accidental, but the works that I found less helpful were works that did not, let me put it this way, a lot of Reformation scholarship is historically geared, which is a great thing. But what I sometimes find is there is a philosophical, the philosophical side of things is just absent. And that has a certain effect, right? Because then when you come to 1517 and you look at Luther's disputation against scholastic theology, you don't know what to do with him naming Scotus or Occam or Beale. So it's less helpful, or maybe even criminal in some circumstances, to write on Luther and try to explain this huge breach without understanding Luther is reacting to Gabriel Beale, and Gabriel Beale has actually misinformed Luther in his writings about Thomas Aquinas. Now, there's a book by John Farthing that does address this, but few people know about it. And so then if you don't pay attention to, like, okay, well, how then is Luther or Calvin, like, what do they think, or how do their successors, like, what did they think about, say, Thomistic realism? But you have to know philosophy to enter that dialogue. But if you don't, then it's not just them. You don't know what to do with, say, a Peter Martyr Vermigli, who is very conscientious of the philosophical ties between his Protestant faith. Some have started to do this. I mean, Richard Muller he has an example where the article he's written is just a short article, and it's called "Not Scotus," and that kind of tells it all. He's looking at examples in the 16th and 17th century and saying, as the Protestants develop, these Protestant scholastics, they come to the conclusion that, yeah, we can't go. We're not going to retrieve that philosophical lineage that comes from Scotus, which then raises the question, right? Well, then which one are they? It's not like they're just rejecting that one. They're then looking to a more Augustinian or even Thomistic philosophical tradition instead. All of that is just, I think there is a huge amount of work to be done there. I just saw a book come out the other day. I haven't read it yet, but on Peter Martyr Vermigli and the metaphysics of the Reformation. And I thought, oh, good. Someone's finally talking about this. But my point is, if we just approach the Reformers and their children, and we ignore the philosophical history, which in large part means we're not familiar with the medieval history as well, then when someone comes along and says, yeah, the Reformers, they're the ones who carry on that voluntarist nominalist virus so that we end up with secularism, well, then we just say, well, goodness, I don't know, maybe they did, and we don't know how to respond.
Thank you, that's helpful. Audrey, did you have a question you wanted to ask earlier? I saw you flash off. There you go.
Well, I just kind of wondered, just recently I heard clergy from the Antiochian Orthodox Church give a presentation, and of course they think of themselves as the earliest part of the representation of the church. I also was at a Catholic funeral very recently, and there was a whole page in the bulletin telling why those who are not Catholic could not receive the Mass, which kind of put one off a bit, because that's saying we're the Christians, you're not really the Christians. But what I wondered was how much of the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment moved away from what the Reformers, or adjusted what the Reformers were saying, and move more towards doctrinal statements. And I just wondered if you could speak to that.
Thank you for that question. It's a big one. And my book doesn't really address it so much, but I have thought about it. Let me just say this. I think if you look at the literature in the 19th and 20th centuries with at the height of Protestant liberalism. Adolf von Harnack, for example. They are quite eager to read the Reformers in light of the Enlightenment to come. And I would go so far to say, in some of the worst cases, they reinterpret the Reformers as if they are modern men. That is an interpretation that I would encourage others to take issue with, because I think that would have been a shock to the Reformers. Luther, we have to remember, right? They didn't think. We use labels like Reformation and 16th century and Protestant and stuff. We have to remember that they thought of themselves very much as what we would call medieval men or women. And so we have to be careful there. I think there can be an agenda, and I think we've seen it with Protestant liberalism, where it has a strong agenda to read modernism back into the Reformers as if this is the beginning. I think that's a mistake. I think that will misread the sources. But also, to your question, I'm not sure if this answers it or not, but I think I would also say, in my mind at least, I see a fairly significant difference between the Reformation and even maybe especially the medieval outlook on the world, and what you then see with modernism. There's been some really good books that have fleshed this out, but I would go so far as to say these are two different paradigms. I think someone like C.S. Lewis, for example, who many of us love so much, saw this. He was almost experiencing it himself as he's entering into a very modern classroom and speaking to modern men, but Lewis has a medieval mind. And I think that's why we love him so much this day, because he says, yeah, the world that you've been presented with, you've been taught that God in the world, that there has been this this cut that then severs your participation in the likeness of God, as if and from there, now you're entertaining questions about whether God is present at all. I think Lewis felt that in his day. All that to say, it kind of sheds a little bit of light on this issue, to say the paradigm of modernism is a very disenchanted world, in which you start to see the seeds that will eventually sprout and blossom that remove God altogether. Whereas the pre-modernist world is a very enchanted world. Today, whenever I teach in class, right, and I talk about how Luther is always talking about the devil, and for many medieval people, the forest was a very magical, but sometimes a very dangerous place, because there could be devils around a tree that could possess you. And my students will laugh, but I will say to them, why are you laughing? Because even if you may not agree with how they're perceiving things exactly, they believe in the supernatural, and they believe that their world is enchanted with God's presence, God's real presence. The question just then becomes, okay, who's right in understanding how we participate in God's presence? And that becomes a matter of debate. And the Protestants enter into that debate. But all that to say, that is a whole nother paradigm than when you enter into modernism, and David Hume and many others start to just raise questions about, like, well, is there even such a thing as, say, efficient or final causality? Wow. That raises, if not, then that changes the whole paradigm as to how we think about, say, God's providence. Is there a purpose that's being worked out? Maybe not. So I would just say, when you're reading the Reformation, keep that in mind, because if you have Luther, in your left hand and then Harnack in your right hand, you should be able to notice, wow, these are two different metaphysical paradigms that lead to two different understandings of real life in the end.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate your participation to all those who are in our audience. And please join me at this point in giving thanks for Matthew for his presentation to us today. So we can all give you a round of applause. And for those who are joining us again at other Reformation conversations, our next ones will be in the fall, and we will let you know which ones they are as we get to them. But before that, there is the International Calvin Congress. If you like Calvin, this is your thing. International Calvin Congress will be in Grand Rapids on the campus of Calvin Theological Seminary, hosted by the Meter Center, from July 25 to July 28. And our overall theme is John Calvin, Exile and Religious Refugees, but that's mostly for the plenaries. There are 40 parallel papers, and they're all sorts of topics on Calvin and Calvinism. So if you just search International Calvin Congress, you'll find us, and you can register that way for the Congress, July 25 through 28. We highly recommend it. But meanwhile, thank you, Matthew. Thank you to everybody who was participating. We have recorded this conversation, and we'll be sending you the link within the next few days. Thanks again. Thank you again, Matthew. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's been a delight.
Wonderful. Bye now.